Hello. I'm happy to be here with you today. My name is Rachel Douglas, and I'm excited to introduce David Gonzalez and Daniel Carlton, the makers of Finding North. Let me present the first question to David. David, can I ask you what inspired you to write Finding North?
Hey, Rachel, thank you. Oh boy, it's a big story. I could say that the inspiration started when I was a kid and I was seeing the civil rights movement unfold in the late 1960s. Yes, I am that old. And some spark inside me was lit. I mean, I didn't have the power to do much, but all my whole life and all my work has been dedicated to trying to make a better world in one way or another. I was at home and the phone rang, and it was my friend Bert, who's the director of a theater in Cincinnati. And he said that they're about to open this amazing new cultural center, the Underground Railroad National Freedom Center. And he asked me if I wanted to write a play to commemorate, to celebrate the opening. And I'm like, Bert, you should find somebody else. I mean, really? But he said, no, they know about you and they want to talk to you. And so I called the folks at this museum who are so amazing, so dedicated to justice and truth and history. And we had a long conversation. And then they showed me their website, which had all these different stories. Many of them were African-American stories, but many of them were not. Many of them were stories of other immigrants and oppressed people, people who were different in one way or another and had to struggle for freedom and safety in our country. And then I thought, wow, these people at the museum are so cool and so generous to be willing to shape an American story out of the Underground Railroad story, to preserve that story and tell it, but to use it as a vehicle that we could all learn from. And so I said yes, and I began to do research. And that's really where the inspiration came from. I started reading books, I started visiting places on the Underground Railroad, I started talking to folks. And once I really got into the history, I got more and more inspired, particularly about John P. Parker, because, hey, a man of such power who came out of being enslaved to becoming someone who freed people from enslavement. His story truly touched me. And I gotta say that that's the big inspiration.
So Thomas asks, how did it feel to play all of the characters by yourself?
Whew. The characters that I played were a lot. Thank goodness I wasn't technically by myself because I was next to the amazing David Gonzalez, who was playing the music live. So he composed the music, which means that he wrote and performed the music based on also his idea of the characters. And so what we were doing was, as I was playing these different people, I was also listening very carefully to the music, and I knew that David was also there. And so I imagined him as a witness from history to all the things that were going on from the past even till now. And so playing those characters, I'll tell you the toughest part, Thomas, is having to erase this idea in my head that I was gonna get these people exactly right. And these are people I never met, right? And so I had to keep constantly saying, if I wanna respect these people and play them, I have to figure out what they have in common. They all wanted freedom. They all wanted the North Star, whatever that meant for them, you know, and they also were just in different times in history. And so playing them meant that I had to ask myself the questions that actors have to ask. It's like, what does the person want? How does the person move through space? And how does that person get a chance to tell their story uninterrupted? And what does it sound like when music is speaking to you at the same time?
Joseph wonders if, or he wants to know what you hope people will learn from your play.
That's an interesting question. As an actor, it's a question that is different for a question as a writer. So I'll answer it as an actor, even though we'll talk about some writing that I put into it. But as an actor, what I hope people get is that I hope that they get the idea of a soul in front of them, like a person who they can see themselves in some kind of way, like how they can relate to that person, and whether it's a big thing or a small thing. And I hope that they see themselves in the other, so that you watch it and you go, oh man, I know what that feels like. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, I know what running is. Oh my God. I may not have been during that time, but I certainly know what that feels like. And so that's what I want people to get from it.
Mm.
And also to imagine their parents, their grandparents, their friends, themselves, everybody that they can think of wrapped in the characters and the sounds that they heard and saw.
Mm.
So I want to chime in on that too. It's a great question. And I have to say that what Daniel just said is how I feel too. As the writer, I wanted these stories to feel universal. I know that's crazy because it's one person's story, but as the writer, I want to get into the kernel of truth, the little point that is so essentially human that anybody could feel it as theirs. The suffering, the pain, the curiosity, the strength, all those primary emotions. These were real people. I interviewed them. I went to people's houses, and John P. Parker, I went to his house. It's a museum, and I sat up in his bedroom and I wrote part of the play from his bedroom window looking across the river. So I tried to get a real feel for these real people. And so my intention, what I wanted it to do was to bring them to life. And of course, Daniel does it so beautifully, but somehow I wrote this so that the life was in the words themselves. And I think you know what I mean. And sometimes you write something and it doesn't quite work. Well, I took a lot of revision to get it so that it felt like those people's real voices, and I recorded them. So it's based on their actual words, but then I had to, cut and paste and make it work so that it flowed theatrically. So one thing is the truth of the narrative as they recorded it. The other thing is, how does it work as a play? And so that was a big part of the job.
David, my next question would be for you, and it's from Poikros. And his question is, how did you get detailed accounts of some of these people's stories? Because some of them are over 150 years old, and a lot of their stories could have been lost to history.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you. The folks at the Underground Railroad National Freedom Center gave me a book. The book is called His Promised Land. It's John P. Parker's story, which he dictated. He told the story to someone who wrote it all down. That story was put in a library and forgotten for over 100 years. It was lost. And in the 1990s, someone found it and published it. And the folks at the museum said this was the book, and this is the person who you should really listen to. So I ate that book up, man. I read it and reread it and underlined it and highlighted and folded the pages. And John P. Parker, he lived in a little town called Ripley, as I showed you in the play. It's about 50 miles east of Cincinnati. So I went there, and I went there many times, and I stayed there and I talked to folks, and I even got to meet some of his relatives. That's an amazing story. What was happening in Cincinnati while I was doing that research was that a young African-American man was killed by a police officer. And like today, the place blew up with outrage. People were furious and were demanding justice. And I realized that this story was not long ago and far away. This is a story of here and now. You know what I mean. And I thought, I need to talk to folks who live here and now to hear their stories too. So I had my recorder and I started going to neighborhoods and I started talking to people. Chester's story, Grandpa, I talked to his grandson. Sylvia, I met her at a Hispanic community center. Erica, I met her at a Jewish center. And Yusuf, I went to that place and I brought my microphone, and I went to many, many places and recorded many, many hours of story. And then I kind of pulled it together, and so that they would support and be a little different and sort of work as a whole. And of course, the John Parker story goes across the whole thing. And one of the great things about this version of Finding North was that Daniel Carlton came into the picture. And we talked about the stories. And I asked Daniel if something like this ever happened to him. And it did. And so I asked Daniel if he'd be willing to contribute a story. And he did. So Daniel, what was that for you to bring your very heavy, deep, important story into the show?
You know, timing is everything. And the writer Ralph Ellison has a quote, which I love, that says, "Geography is fate." Right. And so while we were discussing this play and even going through like a lot of the pieces, George Floyd was murdered around that time. And so outside of my window were people protesting right here. Just like you open the blinds and people are there. And sometimes my partner and she and I would join it. Other times we would like send, hey, we're with you signs. And it was a very like, and I'm going to use the word trigger because that's the only word I can think of. It was a very triggering moment. And I use trigger in the sense that it felt like that the energy that had gone into murdering him was an energy that I understood personally and I had been through. And so it was during that year and the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that, there was this constant Black men shown in many cases being murdered on television. And I thought about what happened to me and how those marches were not just for George Floyd, they were for all of us who find ourselves on the wrong side of what it is that's supposed to be the law and the order. And it's because people have already made you the bad person or the criminal as you walk out the door. They have no problem in treating you in a way that they wouldn't treat somebody else that they thought was innocent, you know? And so when we were doing this, I thought, wow, what is my North Star when you asked me that question? And I just kept thinking, it's if you can get up and you get an opportunity to tell your story, that's part of your North Star, because many people did not get that opportunity to get back up. And so even as I think about it, I'm very, I get emotional because it just happens too often. And what happens to many people is that there's not a camera around. Now you have phones and cameras, but in my case, tourists were taking pictures of me with little cameras where they had to go develop the film, and so there was no outrage about me. I had to pick myself back up and go home. And I'm sure that same day it happened to hundreds, if not thousands of other people who look like me.
Well, I got to say that your story at the end of Finding North brings it home. That we're not talking about people who are 150 years ago or back in Cincinnati, but here you are with us, your lived story. And like you just said, I think that so many people who watch our show have had that same experience. And for you to tell your story was so generous, I want to say, because you have to feel that over again. And when we were recording this, we did that several times. And I remember every time we did a take, we had to stop, and take a breath. And everybody in the room felt that pain. And I just wanted to thank you in front of our audience here for being so willing to share your story with us. You've given us so much in that way.
Just thank you. And just to add to that, two things. One is I'm able to take that breath. And the other thing is that I think that a lot of people don't want to tell their story because there's still a lot of shame and there's a lot of embarrassment about being treated like a criminal like just as you're trying to like go through your day, you know? And so you don't go home and talk about it. Kids don't go home and tell their parents like, yo, I had a day with a cop, and I was just trying to get on the train, and all of a sudden it's like, what are you doing here? And all of a sudden you're up against a wall, and all of a sudden you're just hoping that this person isn't crazy, like that's the thing. You have to hope that you're dealing with a person who hasn't lost their mind before they met you because they got the power. But the power that we have is that we have to tell our stories, and we have to make sure that we always call it out, because like we say in the show, the shame isn't your shame, it's their shame. And we have to keep pushing that story as upfront as the story that has criminalized you and put you in a place in history that you didn't even create, so
Max wanted to know how it felt to be able to string lots of these stories together into like one cohesive tale. So how it felt to take all of these feelings from different positions in life, different perspectives, and put them into one story. And that's for Daniel.
Oh, okay. So it's interesting because once again, that's a writer actor question, because I think they exist on the same level and then they separate a little bit. So as an actor, what you have to do is you have to live what you've been given, right? As an actor. And you have to be careful as an actor that because you have to take projects that you believe in, right? Because you got to commit to it. And so that commitment is, I think, the thing where you can now start making choices, based on the material that you committed to and stringing it together. And so stringing it together meant that I imagined a world where they could like look up in the stars at night and look for the North Star and hear somebody else's story. And that story gave them the courage to tell their story. So that's what I had to do internally as an actor.
I would say as a writer, I was looking for cliffhanger moments, like at what point do you interrupt a John P. Parker story? And what comes at that point, So there's if you look at it, there's these little points where, what's going to happen? Like he left McDowell. Oh my God, he's got to go back. But wait, we're going to hear Sylvia's story. And so you have this feeling like this tension, what I'm talking about. It's left hanging, something else happens, and then you can pick it up. Then it's left again and it's hanging. This is, finding those points as a writer was tricky. I tried it a lot of different ways in a, different order. And so that it feels that you could sustain that. And of course, it takes a great actor like Daniel to carry that across that line, to keep the energy of the initial story bubbling under the surface throughout all these other stories and then bringing it home at the end.
Daniel, I have a question from Brittany about how vulnerable it made you feel to share your story, and whether it was something that for a young actor or a young writer, something that you can give them some advice about making themselves vulnerable.
Yes, I do. One, I say have an exit plan. And so like when you go in, say, when I finish this, I'm going to have some ice cream or a slice of pizza or whatever it is that you do. And so you create I always create a safety plan when I have to do something that is going to be raw. And so I imagine the future, and then I get out of the future and say, okay, I did that. And so my instincts are going to send me there. But while you're doing it, you just have to say to yourself, you have to ask yourself, am I telling the truth? Am I telling the truth? Am I telling the truth? And you have to constantly ask yourself that, because it's easy to start getting into pretend that is making you avoid the feeling, because you got to get into the feeling, but you can't let the feeling be something that's going to destroy you. So this is like an actor technique that you have to do. Sometimes as an actor, you have to substitute things, right? So for example, if this is an idea, if I'm talking about somebody who accused me of something, right? And now I gotta like McDowell, and I gotta go get like, and I'm trying to help somebody escape. I have to think about a situation like, oh, where's a moment in my life where that happened? But when you're telling your story, you have to go into it in a space where you say to yourself, it's all right. It's all right to tell this. It's all right to tell this and stop when I need to,
Mm.
but it's all right to tell it. And once you go, let it go, let it go because you're telling the truth. See, it's an acting thing too. Acting is very tricky. Acting is taking something that mostly didn't happen to you and then using what you know in order to make that come alive. But when it happened to you have to be real careful because you don't really have like that substitution. And so you just take it moment by moment, you know, and that's where you get the spirit of imagination, which I think is the most incredible thing that people have. I've been in a lot of situations where people have suffered, and when you ask them their stories, they generally tell you some story that accessed their imagination to, like Sylvia, the way she smelled the bread, right? Or Yusuf, how he describes his grandmother, or me, how I'm looking at the sidewalk and I'm imagining like that this is a space where I'm going to rise above. See, so just as an actor, your imagination, even when something happened to you, is going to trigger you into places that are going to allow it to grow, but you have to let that, you have to be open to it. And you have to work with people you trust.
Our next question comes from Kimora. So why are we producing this as a video?
All right, Kimora, thank you. This was not written for video, believe me. This was written for live performance. And what you might not know is when this was first written, I played all the parts and I had a different person playing the music. And then Finding North went away for a bunch of years. I thought it would be a great time to bring it back now because of the kind of things Daniel was talking about, particularly George Floyd's murder. And it's the pandemic. And what are we going to do? I mean, I went to some protests. You probably did too. It was time for this story to get out. And since we can't be live in a theater or come to your school, the next best choice was this medium. But this is really made for the stage. And our idea is that Daniel and I will come touring at schools and colleges and theaters around the country so you can feel those feelings. It's a different thing watching it on a screen and when that performer is live with you. You know what I'm talking about. There's power, and talk about vulnerability. It's right there. Live theater, live performance, and video, those are two different worlds. So our intention in making it a video was to do something, to share something, to be of use somehow in this wacky, crazy time. But the idea of this play is to make it alive, present, so you can meet Daniel after the show, talk to him, so you can hear it and feel it in a more direct way.
Kimora, I'll tell you what was very interesting is that when we filmed this on a stage, right? Me, David, and a really nice man who was doing the camera. When we filmed it, it was the first time that I had been outside of like 5 blocks from around my house. The only place I'd ever been was the grocery store and the park, and then back home, and super masked up and careful. And so when I went up to where David lives and we performed it in a theater, I was so happy that he decided to perform it, to film it on a stage, because that really helped me a lot, instead of us doing it like as a movie. So what we brought to you is as close as we could get to what that is. And we all want to be in front of you. We all want to have that experience, right? There is nothing like an actor in an audience and you all being right there and hearing David's music live, man, is there anything better than a live guitar? You know, like when it's really good. Is there anything better than an actor? You can see the sweat, you know, and you can like, oh my God, is he crying? You know, they laughing. We laugh together, and here comes, and look, he's got his guitar. Ooh.
Live next time.
Live, yes, live. We'll see. We'll see. Come on, we're gonna be around. We're gonna figure it out.
Daniel, I have a question from Zaid, and he wants to know if, beyond sharing your story, if you had a favorite story that you liked performing or expressing in Finding North.
That's a tough question. I was in love with all of these people. And so there was something about each and every one of them that I really enjoyed, for different reasons. John P. Parker was a lot of fun because he was always so active, and I like being active. You know, I like when you're just moving and getting it and going for something. So I really liked him for that reason a lot. And I was really moved by Erica, because she and Grandpa both, you know, managed to like survive and tell it, and they went so far back. And I always have a thing about elders, you know, and what they bring, because you can't take for granted that you're always going to be able to hear them. And so anytime like you can tell one of their stories, it's like it just moves me. So I get really attracted to being able to channel like an elder story, because you know tomorrow they could be gone.
David, can I ask you if you were attached in particular to one story, or there's one that you want to highlight?
Well, since I was there when I recorded these stories and I met all these folks,
Yeah.
I really loved meeting Yusuf. You know, he was 15 years old, and what happened to him was so cruel, but he had so much dignity in how he told it, you know. And then this whole thing about his grandma. So again, the elders, and where he kind of moved from this high school situation and this violence and this hatred and this bias and this racism. And it kind of traveled in his story to his grandmother and how she buried the rabbit and how she gave this beautiful wisdom, you know, to sometimes you have to throw yourself into goodness. And I remember when he was telling that to me, I was like, this kid feels all of that, you know? So I have a particular love of Yusuf's story. And I just got to say that John Parker's bravery and courage and vulnerability, you know, he was taking his life in his hands. And that when Daniel was like, oh, he's gonna open his door, you know, that moment is so deep, you know, so deep. Like how much are you willing to give, you know? And he laid it, you know, he saved over 400 people. 400 people. And those people went on to have babies, and those people went on to have babies. And who knows, you know, like how many humans are alive today, breathing, loving, making art, doing good things in the world, because that one man had the courage to open that latch. You know what I'm saying? So when Daniel does that at that moment, you feel the vulnerability and the courage together. It's so small, right? But John P. Parker's story to me is like, I get chills. I got chills right now because it's so deep, so true.
You know what I like about David's writing, taking John P. Parker, because it's a big life. And so like how David took like the situations of his life of crossing to receive to get. Because when you think about situations like slavery or any of these other horrible situations, sometimes it's so big that it's hard to like feel for people, because you're feeling for the situation, right? Because there's so many people. but to bring it and like put it in the body of a person who had to make that choice and to come back, it's like, it's not that he owns that one story, but we get a chance at least to get a very specific person, in that moment, and I'm going to tell you, I had never heard, I don't know about you all. I didn't know about John P. Parker before I did this show. I knew, of course, about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, but I didn't know about his story. And so the power of what David did is he made his story. So he didn't create his story, but he presented it in a way where we could follow it through very specific things. And who on this planet does not want to go with the person who is trying to oppress them and win?
I just got to say that if you get your hands on his book, John P. Parker's book, His Promised Land, there are so many other stories. I just chose that one story with the McDowells, but there were so many to blow your mind. When you go to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, there's this, the first thing you do is you got to go, I think you do have to go to this little movie theater, and they show a film. And what they show a film about is John Parker. They reenact some of these escapades. So in that part of the world, in Ohio, there's John P. Parker schools, there's John P. Parker highways, there's a John P. Parker deli, it's like, I like to think that he's an unsung hero. And I just got to say, just so you, in case you want to check this out, after we did Finding North originally, the Cincinnati Opera Company saw it and wanted to do an opera about it. And so there's an opera out there called Rise for Freedom, which is basically this play done as an opera. And it was a great, great privilege to work on that as well.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today. So Daniel, can I ask you for some summation of thoughts about your experience with Finding North and your experience playing these characters and sharing your own story?
My experience in doing Finding North is, I'm very happy that we get an opportunity without even meeting you all to be able to share. I wish we were having a back and forth with you, me, David, and Rachel, but so thank you for your questions. So for me, even in playing Finding North, it just makes me think about the heroes, sheroes, heroes, the brave people, and someone, or you're not that disconnected from someone who had to make a decision that things had to change and things had to stop, whether they moved somewhere differently, or whether they did something differently, or whether they helped another person get to what they needed to do. And so you're not that far away from it. And every time we even talk about Finding North, I just get a flood of people that I'm thinking about, and I wonder, like, what happened, And so I hope that that does that for you too, that it asks you to think about the people in your life, and it might even be you. You might have done something that may seem really small, but that helped another person get across some river, not an actual river, but something that was blocking them from feeling free or feeling happier or feeling like they belong. How about you, David? Same question.
Oh boy. You just said so much, Daniel. There's very little I can add to that. I just got to say it's the same thing for me. I want Finding North to inspire folks to do the right thing. And you know what that is. Fairness and equality, justice is a human right. And all these barriers that people put up between us and the violence that is often used to sustain those barriers is just wrong. And we all know that. And it takes small acts of courage to change that. And that's what I want Finding North to do. Listen, these were great questions, and I know there's a lot more. I can recommend to you that you go to the Underground Railroad National Freedom Center website, which is freedomcenter.org. Freedomcenter.org. There's a tremendous amount of resources and videos and things to look at. And of course, you can do all your own research as well. That's what I did. That's what Daniel does when he's working on a project. He digs in. That's what Rachel did, also looking at these questions. Use your mind, dig in, be true, and we'll see you again. Thanks so much.